pretty sure the United Arab Emirates is mining Bitcoin with those new reactors they just turned online. There hasn't been much like fanfare and announcement of it, but the reactors came online, and then like a few months later, it was announced that there was a partnership with Marathon Digital Holdings, which is one of the like top five Bitcoin mining companies in America.
Just because the facts are A, if the narrative is B and everyone believes the narrative, then B is what matters. But it's our job in our industry to speak up proudly, soberly, and to engage people in this dialogue. Those 2.5 billion people that are in energy poverty, they need us.
America cannot meet this threat alone.
If there is a single country,
of course, the world cannot meet it without America.
that is willing to
But we're going to need you, the next generation, to finish the
overhaul
job.
nuclear regulations,
We need scientists to design new
and
fuels.
focus on net public
We
benefit
need engineers to invent new technologies. We
over absurd levels of radiation
need
protection,
entrepreneurs to sell those
then
technologies.
we will march towards this.
We need workers to operate assembly lines that hum with high-tech, zero-carbon
We have
components.
unlimited prosperity for all humans.
We need diplomats and businessmen and women and Peace Corps volunteers to help developing nations skip past the dirty phase of development and transition to sustainable sources of energy. In other words, we need you.
Okay, welcome to another episode of the Fire Fission podcast, where we discuss energy-dense fuels and how they can better human lives. Today we've got Ryan MacLeod, who's a laboratory technician at Canadian Nuclear Labs up in Canada. Ryan, how you doing?
I'm doing great. It's a beautiful Monday morning up here in Canada.
Fantastic. We've actually spoken before, which is super fun. You were on the Young Professionals in Energy podcast with a panel last year, and very excited to chat with you again, specifically just you. You know, you've had a foray into Bitcoin mining and talking about how it can be done with nuclear, and so we'll dive into that. But for those who haven't heard you before, you know, you've been on several other podcasts, but for those who haven't heard you, why don't you give us a little bit of background on yourself and yeah, why you're interested in nuclear and Bitcoin.
Thanks, Mark. So, as Mark stated, I'm Ryan MacLeod. I'm a laboratory technologist at Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. And recently, within the last, early 2021, I started to take an interest in Bitcoin in parallel with with an interest in learning about the small modular reactor developments that are going on here in Canada and abroad. And then as I learned about how Bitcoin mining is a massive consumer of electricity, but also incredibly flexible, it can provide services to act as a flexible load for power plants to basically improve their economics by ensuring that they no longer have to curtail their electricity. There's now a global market that they can sell their electricity into merely by just having computers to plug into their power source. It doesn't really matter what power source. Like, I'm very excited about the projection of where it can go with nuclear power, but it's happening with hydroelectric, it's happening with wind, with solar, geothermal. There's even a guy in Hawaii trying to set up a ocean thermal energy conversion plant that's going to be financed by the Bitcoin mining that is associated with it. So there's a lot of excitement on the Bitcoin and energy front over the last year that is only escalating as it's looking like a higher probability that Bitcoin miners and power plant owners are going to eventually just be one in the same. It's just going to be another tool that all grids can use to just improve economics, to improve stability. It's got a lot of potential, but not without its own controversy.
Absolutely, yeah. We can talk about a couple of those points. What are you most excited about in the nuclear space?
I'm very excited that we're finished building some large nuclear reactors around the world, the ones in the United Arab Emirates, and then the Vogel reactor in Georgia. And then I think the Hinkley Point C reactor is almost finished up in the UK. There's lots of excitement about the small modular reactors, and there's many countries pursuing as many as 70 different designs using sizes of outputs, different cooling types. So it'll very, very much increase the applications of nuclear power beyond just having like one large power plant in one central location that powers like a city or an industrial sector. But now with the small modular reactors, we can deploy power plants that run on nuclear fission as small as like 5 megawatts, 1 megawatt that can be deployed to like remote communities that and transfer them off of diesel, or like upgrade coal plants to nuclear plants where you don't need like a full gigawatt, but only like 300 megawatts would be sufficient. There's lots of talk about using small modular reactors for their heating capacity as well, because some of these reactors will be able to generate heat up to 6, 7, 800 degrees Celsius, which will enable them to apply to be used in various other industries like chemical production, petrochemical stuff, various other applications outside of just the pure electrical sphere. So we'll see lots of like
Absolutely.
hydrogen electrolysis type of stuff, and it's very, very exciting for all the different peripheral technologies that can benefit from nuclear power. And it's being pursued very, very vigorously, especially here in Canada and several European countries.
Yeah. There's a project being built at CNL, isn't there?
Yes, Canadian Nuclear Labs will be hosting the demonstration unit of Ultra Safe Nuclear Company's 5 megawatt micro modular reactor. So
That's right.
that's what we're getting into. So that'll be the first new operating reactor that Canadian Nuclear Labs has built. We have several research lab reactors here, but our major ones, the NRU and the NRX, have been shut down of just after their 50, 60-year operating lives. But it's very
That's
exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. That's USNC. Do you know the timeline on that, or how soon?
We we're expecting 27, like 28 if things get delayed, but it
Okay.
is hard to predict in the current environment with financing and supply chains, and everything is very
Sure.
much out of whack. So it's an optimistic timeline, and I hope we can hit it, but it would
Yeah,
not be a surprise if it slipped a little bit, considering the broader macroeconomic environment we find ourselves in right now.
sure. No, that's interesting, and I'm familiar with USNC, and I know some of the folks over there, but I'd forgotten that. Yeah, they're working on the project at CNL. So I'm curious, what kind of lab work do you do?
I
Tell me a little bit
support
about your day job.
Yeah, I operate a lab along with a partner, and we do the day-to-day analysis of the scrape campaigns from the CANDU reactor fleet, and that's where they take a sample from the inside of the pressure tubes, and then we monitor it with mass spectrometers to determine how much hydrogen and deuterium has ingressed into the metallic structure of the zirconium pressure tubes, and it just monitors the corrosion rate so that lowers the probability of there ever being a one of these pressure tube cracks and that can leak
Gotcha.
moderator water into the cooling water. Is There was an event that happened way back in the 70s, and then that's what initiated the commissioning of the laboratory that I now operate. I basically just babysit and troubleshoot the machines and make sure they continue running samples. So
Yeah. Is the corrosion rate significant or continuous, linear?
it is pretty linear and continuous. Like you can see the graphs just go a nice straight line over 30 years, and then once they reach a certain threshold, then that's when they do things like shut down for the current refurbishment plan at the CANDU reactor fleet. So we've currently have two, maybe I think three reactors down for refurbishments right now, and they should be back operational sometime early
Gotcha.
next year. So we're in a weird spot here in Ontario because we're not at maximum capacity because we're trying to extend the life of our reactor fleet here and well into the 60s.
Yeah, 60 years, right?
If you take good
Um,
care of them, they last a long time.
absolutely. So how did you get involved with Bitcoin mining, or how'd you get interested in it? And talk to us a little bit about the competition that occurred last year and you guys' travel to Japan.
Yeah, I got into Bitcoin. I came into it for the number go up when there was that very exciting bull run in the beginning of 21 where it shot up from like under 10,000 per Bitcoin to over 40,000 in a very short period. It attracted a lot of people that were entering the space. But I really started to dig into it when learned about the Bitcoin mining process and the way that it can converts electricity into hash rate, and then that's what contributes to the network to generate new blocks and add them to the ledger. It was when I heard about a company called Upstream Data. They are building small data centers with a gas generator inside of them that can be easily transported to any oil site that has a flared gas problem or just gas that they cannot afford to build the infrastructure to bring it to the market. So typically that will just get burnt on site because there's really nothing else to do with it. But then there's emissions liabilities, there's economic liabilities. It's bad practice, but there's really no other way to deal with it
Yeah.
in order to get the oil that we need for countless other products. So what these guys did is they just started feeding that what gas that would otherwise have gone through a flare stack, and they just feed it into a generator that then feeds these computers and then generates the hash rate and then gets rewarded in the Bitcoin. And so it took a liability that oil producers were having, and it flipped it into a new monetization stream. And then when I was in a conversation with my wife Heidi, we she threw out the idea of doing that with small modular reactors, especially since we want to deploy them to a wider range of applications in remote locations. Not always going to be like a certainty of demand for that electricity, and a lot of power projects will not get built just because of that demand uncertainty. If you don't have an anchor customer for that power, then you're not going to find investors very excited to be a part of your project, and then that's
Right.
where these projects typically fail. So then the idea, like I just started thinking about the idea a lot and reaching out to others and like how this could work and how we can apply it to the small modular reactors. And then you start going on these other tangents, learning about grids and all the electrical engineering that goes into balancing and managing a grid, and how the peaker plants work, and how transmission congestion works. And then you just start seeing all these little liabilities. You're like, well, if they're over generating here, then we can plug in the miners here, and then they'll just absorb that load. It's kind of like a battery, but not quite a battery, because like a battery is something that you store the electrons in, and then you can take them out in their original form. Whereas Bitcoin's more like condensing electricity into a secondary product that's used on a secondary market, something like
Right.
steel, like we condense energy into steel, and then it allows us to defy gravity with the structures that we can build. And this is just a way to do that digitally. And it provides a really good opportunity for power plants and power plant owners to monetize electricity that they otherwise would have no value for, because it would either be over generating, and then that causes reliabilities to the grids and power systems, or it could be like undersupplied, and then you're going to have situations where your higher priority customers aren't receiving the electricity that they need. So what I'm pushing for is, with the Bitcoin mining, we can increase the size of the power plants that we want to build wherever we want to build them. And then we can use the Bitcoin mining as an anchor customer to ensure that they've always have somebody at the margins to pay for their electricity, that can also shut off should there be a situation where there is an increased demand from the local grid, or like something like a hospital would take much higher prioritization than a Bitcoin mine. Like if you would go up the stack of what would turn off first in a situation where grid capacity needs to be freed up for other customers. So it just adds a very effective new tool to power producers, and there's all kinds of new innovations of how they're using it throughout the world. Like Africa is of great interest. Like lately, there's countries going in, or companies going around Africa and trying to find like very small power opportunities, like a hydroelectric dam that generates like 70, 80 megawatts, but then the community only needs 30 megawatts. But because of
Mm.
that major gap, then yeah, it's hard to find
Yeah.
somebody to finance this project. So they'll fill in that 40 kilowatts with like, that's only like 10, 11 ASICs. And then yeah, then they can turn them on and off as the community needs that power. And then it can also, because they have that extra power stream, or that money stream coming from the Bitcoin miners, they can offer a lower price per kilowatt to the rest of the customers. So it's ultimately becomes a win-win-win for like the power project owner, the grids, the just the general users. Like I think it's got a really good shot at working, and
Gotcha.
I think it's going to, before we know it, conversations like this are just going to be like, yeah, like it's obvious.
So one of the members of our team is very excited about Bitcoin mining, and another one doesn't think that there's much value in it. In my experience, it seems to be a common sentiment that people are either all in or don't really understand it. So, but what would you say Why is Bitcoin mining different from other cryptocurrencies, and what value does it have for society more broadly?
Well, having an open, decentralized ledger that anybody can participate in and anybody can use to exchange value permissionlessly and without being censored is of a great value to the world right now, especially since we see that some people may have woken up this morning and not been able to access the funds in their bank for all we know. Like Swiss Bank just had to take a massive bailout. So that
Yeah,
system is precarious itself. So it's the people with Bitcoin are sleeping comfortably tonight, knowing that they have custody of their wealth and that they can send it to whoever they need to send it. They can make payroll if they're caught in a situation where they can't access their bank accounts. Like I don't know exactly how this is all going to play out. If this is just the early stages of like similar to like a 2008 type of crash, but watching banks fail is never a good sign. But having an alternative that people can start to transition towards is of great value. And the Bitcoin mining, the proof of work algorithm that it uses, and yes, like I've heard the complaints that if they don't see the value of the token, they don't see any value whatsoever for the mining process. But it's like any commodity, like it has a production value that's if the cost to produce it is less than the cost that you can sell it on the open market, there's going to be an incentive for people to find opportunities to generate it for less than they can sell it on the market for. So if you've got electricity less than 6 cents kilowatt hour right now, you're in a really good shape and you will be mining Bitcoin profitably. And then if the value of Bitcoin goes up in conjunction with the banking system going down and the liquidity being injected into the system to prop everything up, that's just going to be more money sloshing around trying to find a home. And
yeah,
Bitcoin's a good home for it because you can take self custody of it. Like once you've moved your Bitcoin onto your device and you have your private keys, there's nobody that can take that away from you. There's nobody that can stop you from using it. The worst that they can do is to complicate your ability to exchange the government issued fiat currencies for Bitcoin. That's really the only avenue they have that can really choke off Bitcoin, which some would argue that that is part of what happened with these banks that crashed because the three major banks, the Signature, Silvergate, and Silicon Valley, they were all heavily invested in the crypto industry. So
mm,
they to shutting them down would be a massive blow towards the entire crypto industry just because it makes it difficult for banking. Like there's many industries that have trouble with their finances just because they aren't an acceptable industry that the banking industry wants to participate with. Like we've seen it with like cannabis and like pornography type of stuff that it's
sure.
it's very complicated to get a bank when that you're in those lines of works. So and then also there's people around the world that just don't have banks. There's 2 billion people that don't have a bank account. And now with a smartphone, you can have your own bank account that is your own self-custody. And it's actually quite impressive. But
Yeah.
then yeah, like the proof of work versus like the proof of stake, like those are completely different um protocols. So where
So
where
let's just dive into those. What is the difference between proof of work and proof of stake?
Well, proof of stake is similar to like shareholder type of the system where whoever holds the most shares of the token gets the most rewards from the newly issued tokens. Whereas in Bitcoin, with the proof of work algorithm, it's a computing process that's using electricity in the to have a real world connection between the ledger and the power that's used to create it. So it gives it like what's the word I'm looking for? An unforgeable costliness is what it's referred to, and I think Nick Bhatia came up with that concept with it that a good money has to have like a costliness associated with it. If your money can be created with just the stroke of a key, then it's not good money, and it's ultimately going to dilute, and everything measured against it will be disrupted. It's like having a measuring stick that's made of elastic, and it's
Yeah.
difficult. it's difficult to make accurate measurements when one day your measuring stick is 1 meter, and then the next day it's a meter five, and then it's 95 centimeters. Like on paper, it will say that all of the houses are the exact same square footage, but when you actually go and measure them with a stable measuring stick, they're all going to be different. And like that's what's happening in our current fiat system. And the crypto like proof of stake system is just a digitized version of just the stakeholder capitalism where he who has the largest bags reaps the largest rewards, which so then it just fulfills the prophecy of like who he who has the most, more will be given, and then it just keeps filtering more towards the top layers of these institutions. And then the problem is they're so easy to spin up these like proof of stake cryptocurrencies that although there's a few of them that have like good technological value and maybe providing something that our society will find use for. But the problem is most of them are just outright pump and dump schemes where somebody will just create something,
Yeah.
they'll give all of the tokens pre-mined to like their buddies or early stakeholders, and then they'll pump it up with a bunch of slick marketing, and then they'll sell it on retail as soon as it goes above the cost of that they use to produce it, and then they'll just keep cycling through that, and it just turns the whole thing into a casino, and it distracts people from like the actual value of something like Bitcoin, where like it's it's just a completely different fixed commodity. It's just a piece of software that people engage with on the internet where and then everything else somebody cloned the code that Bitcoin runs on. So they can say, "Oh, we're going to make Bitcoin, but we're going to make a trade-off and it's going to be bigger blocks or faster blocks or just every time that there's been a
Yeah.
trade-off made, it sacrifices something somewhere else. So like the Bitcoin focuses on security and decentralization on its base layer. It sacrifices the scalability. So I'm sure you've heard, and many have heard that like that it only processes 7 transactions per second, but that is at the layer that would be compared to like the way that the central banks settle their books with the Fedwire or the Swift system. Whereas now a second layer built on Bitcoin, the Lightning Network, is enabling higher throughput, but it does sacrifice a little bit on the on a few trade-offs, but it enables near instant, near free final settlement transactions with anybody anywhere in the world. So it takes that 7 transactions per second throughput at the big Bitcoin base layer and essentially makes it infinite at the second layer. Is similar to how like the internet protocol layer, like we don't really talk about like TCP and IP. That's the first layer of the internet. The layer
Right.
that we're using here is like the sixth or seventh layer that's built on top of that. So the Bitcoin, the base layer is the foundation, and then everything that's built upon that will improve its usability and throughput. And then you can do things like the Lightning Network enables you can have a wallet that has various different currencies, and you can send them to somebody and they'll receive it in whatever currency they want to. But behind the scenes, it's using the Bitcoin infrastructure instead of the typical fiat banking infrastructure, which most of these banks don't even communicate with each other because they have to have like bridges built between them because this like the software and their systems they're not interoperable the way that the Lightning Network is now.
The piece that always stands out to me is the decentralized ledger. At its foundation, it's essentially an accounting system that we've gamified. For people not familiar with it, saying the mining and having coins and tokens and wallets, these are kind of just terms that have helped to gamify the system and give it a structure that is easier for people to understand. But at its core, we're essentially just using energy to cloud compute and keep track of transactions.
Yeah, pretty
Am
much.
I am I oversimplifying it there?
Yeah, it's an immutable ledger, and yeah, and the miners
Yeah,
are competing with each other to be the first to issue the next new block that gets appended to the ledger, but they're collaborating with each other to build the ledger. And then with
right.
each new block, that's adding a new layer of energy that would need to be overcome for somebody with nefarious intent to go back and try to rewrite a block that's already established in the blockchain. So it's
Yeah.
essentially creating an energy force field around the entire blockchain that protects it from being changed, and it prevents counterfeiting of the token, because there's tens of thousands of people running an exact replica of the entire blockchain just on their computer, and all of those nodes check and verify each other's work, and then when a miner presents a valid block, the nodes all confirm that that block is valid, like, because it's a very difficult, time-consuming process to find a valid block, but then once you've found that block, it's very easy to validate that you found that block. Kind of like just going through a pile of keys to unlock a door. If everyone's searching through those keys, once you find the key that works, anybody can take that key and be like, "Yes, that works. You win the prize." But then what's cool about the Bitcoin mining is the difficulty adjustment. It forces the block time to be a constant 10 minutes. And any time that it starts to deviate away from that 10 minutes, after 2016 blocks, it will recalibrate itself and it'll make it more difficult to find that next valid block, either by, essentially just by using that analogy that I use, just adding more keys to the pile.
Right.
And then if it gets slower, they'll take more keys away from the pile, and then it's a dynamic equilibrium between the more computing power there is, the harder it is to find a valid block, and then the less computing power, the easier it is to find the blocks.
Right. So we can use the technology for Bitcoin mining, and there's specific computers that are built in to run this software, but this application has a parallel or identical application for cloud computing, right?
Yeah, kind of. But the cloud computing is more needs to be like stable and on all the time. Like you can't, it's not as friendly to interruption, because that would disrupt people's services and whatever they're using. Like if it's a
Sure.
like an AWS server, a Google server, like they need 99.99% uptime, which is great, and they will definitely provide a large stable load for nuclear reactors. But where I find the Bitcoin mining the most exciting is in its flexibility and how they've been able to serve various ancillary products in various grid applications that they find themselves in. Like for instance, there was the storm in Texas a few months ago where the miners, they I think it was about 1.2 gigawatts worth of capacity was turned offline. That was just the Bitcoin miners that they freed all up that capacity to allow the
Wow.
grid to use that electricity. So that's a really good service that they provide. And then like another way that we're seeing it used, environmentalists hate this one, but there's a lot more nuance to it than they seem to be willing to look into. But there's a coal plant and a natural gas plant that's mining Bitcoin, and it's improved the economics. And the environmentalists hate it because they claim that it revived a coal plant. But what it's actually doing is it's making that coal plant run more efficiently because it's a peaker plant, and peaker plants will have less emissions per kilowatt hour of generation if they're able to run at a stable load. If you're constantly taking your peaker plant, whether it's gas or
Yep.
coal or hydro, and you're ramping it up and ramping it down, you're putting unnecessary wear and strain on your turbines and just your whole system, and you ruin your economics, and it's just less efficient on your emissions per kilowatt hour. So what the miners are doing is enabling them to run at a stable load. So overall, they may be putting out like slightly more emissions than they would otherwise, but they're also like in this facility so that it's providing jobs to that community, the emissions per kilowatt hour is down, and
The
it
cost
just
of that electricity is certainly going to be lower too then.
yeah,
Uh,
because typically your peakers
Meaning
are
for
your
when you're not using it for when you're not using it for mining, but using it for actually power load, it should be less expensive.
yeah, it should, and especially since peaker plants are used as that marginal like energy provider, so they're often like the top of the stack as the electricity demand goes up. And if you can avoid having to access the power from the peaker plants, like you can keep your marginal emissions of that electricity and the cost way down. But as soon as that peaker plant gets tripped, like the marginal effects on your grid start getting a lot more out of whack, and like the accounting for like the emissions and the cost of your electricity
Yeah.
starts to get a little bit more complicated. So yeah, so if you can just run everything stable, it just makes life so much easier for your grid operators. But then what I'm proposing here is now, instead of trying to balance with peaker plants and like a generation that's variable, we can just build a base load that's far larger than we would have normally conceived, because you typically only want to build it about 10% larger than what your expected needs are going to be, to minimize your economic losses to curtailment and surplus generation. But now, by having the mining in play, we can build them far larger, and then we can just turn down the Bitcoin mining when the local community needs to use that capacity.
Yeah,
And then
makes
then
total
you don't
sense.
yeah, then you don't need the peaker plant anymore, because it basically takes the peaker plant and makes it virtual on the load side.
Yeah. So do you foresee that as being an opportunity to help catalyze nuclear?
Oh, absolutely. This project that just came online in Pennsylvania at the what is it, the Talon Energy Cumulus Coin project at the Susquehanna reactor. They're providing a very good first example of how this relationship can be found, whether it's a company contracting with an existing power company and then using their excess generation, or it's going to be the Bitcoin miners that just want their own vertically integrated power systems to just minimize counterparty risk, because anything that they can bring in house to under their roof will benefit their bottom line, because the less you have to depend on any counterparties, and like the risk of your electricity price going all over the place. Like, if you have the asset and own it for yourself, you have a lot lot more stable ability to manage that asset.
Right. So are there any challenges that stand in the way? And one that comes to mind, and I'm just curious on your thoughts on this, is that for any asset, utilization of it and increased utilization to increase the capacity factor, so to speak, will make it more profitable. And when I've personally looked into mining, because I come from the oil and gas sector, and we've looked at putting it on flare sites, and when I've done the economics, it's challenging if you're not above a certain utilization capacity. There's a cost to the miners and a cost to the computers. So I'm just curious on your thoughts there. How variable or intermittent could this be to still be a profitable project?
It depends on a few factors. Like, there's definitely the policy concerns. There's definitely your financing. When you buy your hardware is a major point of how your operation is going to look. Because if you bought hardware on debt at the top of the market, then you're likely in a situation where you're going to need to sell that hardware in order to service your debt, but you're going to be selling that hardware at a much lower cost, because the value of the underlying asset that the hardware is essentially a derivative of dropped significantly. So we we're I think we've come back from the bottom, but who knows at this point? Bitcoin is a very fickle commodity that could surprise us onto the downside again, but it seems to be stable where it is. But so the hardware has also come down. So you have to measure, yeah, your all-in cost of electricity is your major primary operating input, and then your major capital inputs is the cost of your hardware. So you want to, like, minimize the amount per terahash that you're going to be paying. And so there's also different tiers of hardware that you can use. Like, you can use the newest out of the box off of the assembly line 19XP Pros, and getting you'll have a much higher capital expenditure, but your operating expenditure will be much less. Or you can go for older equipment that you can pay a lot less for, but it's not as efficient, and your operating expenses will be significantly higher. So it's all about finding the right balance, and what your personal business you want it to look like. Like, there's like the companies that went bankrupt, or had a bad time in the bear market, were the ones that took on a lot of debt to try and pump up their share values when we were in the bull
Hmm.
market, and that came back to bite a lot of them in the butt. But then the ones that held tight and didn't get over their skis and played the more tortoise strategy, now they're well capitalized. They built lots of infrastructure, and now they're able to buy the hardware very cheap because it's being let go of by these companies that are having to sell it much lower than what they paid for it to either service their debt or their payroll or just stay
Yeah.
afloat in this very turbulent environment we find ourselves in. But it seems the price coming up a little bit, it seems to have taken a little bit of pressure off of the miners that had the tightest margins. And then you've got home miners too. Like a lot of the people that are mining Bitcoin in their basement, they're knowingly doing it not at a profit. Most of them are finding some clever way to use the heat exhaust to basically act as a space heater. Or myself personally, I have two S9s rigged into my dryer because my dryer element broke. So I had a heat source, so I just took ducts and I put them into my dryer. And I've seen all
Love it.
kinds of crazy engineering setups where they're heating pools, they're heating hot tubs, they're heating like the inline flooring, water
Yeah.
tanks, just ducting it right into their HVAC systems, greenhouses, drying wood, drying like produce, like that opens up a whole other avenue of services that the Bitcoin miners can provide as well. Like if we do start building small modular reactors in northern Canada where it's cold, having like a space heater that also just basically is a money printer would also be a huge benefit to these communities as well. They'd be able to use them to provide heat for greenhouses and various other local services that these communities would need.
Yeah. So what's the crypto community's perception on the fall in value? So the peak price was what, like $65,000 US dollars per Bitcoin, and it got down to about $16,000 in end of 22, the start of 23. What's the, I'll say, consensus, if there is one, or perhaps two or three leading theories on the pullback?
Depends on your perception. If you're in it for speculating and like gambling on just the value of the commodity, then yeah, the
Yeah.
ups and downs definitely will get you wrecked. For the like
Or
the
get you
bit,
rich.
it very could, but it's for every
Yeah.
get rich story you hear, there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of get wrecked stories that you don't hear.
Yep. Yep.
But then, like, if you're one of like the Bitcoin, like the hodlers, the maximalists, whatever they like to call their crazy laser-eyed bunch on Twitter, it's very exciting community, a bunch of very diverse range of personalities in this community. But they are actually quite happy when the price goes down because they get to buy more sats for less, and they are very well educated on what they hold, all of the peripheral industries and technologies that it touches. Like when you start taking Bitcoin seriously, like you learn about the Austrian economics, Keynesian economics, monetary history, like just what is money in general, like how it came from being like rye stones on an island, and then how it became gold, and then how it became paper, and just what we think of as money is a massive rabbit hole that many people have never been exposed to. And then when you start learning about it, you start to see the world and history in a lot different way. And then yeah, you start learning about
Yeah.
mathematics and cryptography, and once you've learned enough, you develop a conviction about this technology where there is very little that would shake these hardcore hodlers off of their Bitcoin until it is actually many of them will never give up their Bitcoin. They will hold on to it until Bitcoin is just what we use. They're that set in their ways, and they're that confident that that is the trajectory that we are heading on. But it's going to be a tough slog for the next few years because we're in a very weird phase for fiat currencies. And most people kind of have the fishbowl experience with fiat currencies because if you're swimming in the water, you never really realize that you're in the water. So
Yeah.
most people don't really see fiat because it's just the way that it is. They take it for granted and they don't understand how the underlying like functionality of that money works. Like who decided that 2% was the optimal rate that your wealth should be devalued every year. Like it's just a made up number that they were like it's large enough that we can continue to devalue the currency, but it's not so big that people are going to start to panic. But now we start getting into these situations where inflation starts getting up 6, 7, 8%. In some countries like Lebanon, it's up in three figures. So it's
Yeah.
it's a weird place right now to be a fiat maximalist, and the banks are in a massive panic mode right now.
Yeah,
And
that's a really interesting thought. I like your fishbowl analogy, and even for myself, when I finally realized that money was essentially made up in the collective imagination of all humans, it wasn't actually a tangible thing. Yeah, it gives you kind of a different perspective of the world. Do you see any new business models emerging? Miners with contracts or operating investors? What? Yeah, talk to me a little bit about how this space might change in the future.
we're going to see all kinds of different power purchase agreements that the miners will try to seek out the lowest wholesale rate of electricity that they can get their hands on, and they'll make concessions in order to get those prices by providing the like demand response services or any other ancillary service that they'll put them at the first on the stack to be shut down when the grid needs that electricity. And in some cases they'll get paid for it, and some just do it because if you have an unregulated grid and your spot price of electricity is fluctuating, the miners will just instinctively turn off once the spot price of electricity reaches their break even point, just out of economic
Sure.
thinking. But yeah, there's an infinite way that these businesses can be configured. And like some of them, like there will definitely be better strategies than other, but it does seem like the slow tortoise strategy of just building infrastructure and then filling that infrastructure with ASICs and then the finding the power to go with it. That seems to be the optimal strategy because the ones that got excited in the bull market seem to get a little bit too over their skis. And but it's good because it recycles the capital through the system. As if you make bad decisions with your financing and you end up going bankrupt, then that capital just gets recycled into a company that managed their operation better. And
Yeah.
ultimately for the ecosystem, it's a good thing. It's creative destruction is a good thing. You need to flush out the garbage every once in a while, which I'm pretty sure that's what's been going on the last year just in the wider crypto industry in general. Like we were coming off nearly a decade of incredibly low interest rates. Like cash was flush everywhere. Everybody had tons of money to throw around. There were projects that were getting financing that really shouldn't have been getting financing just because everyone's just throwing darts and just seeing what would stick. And it's looking like, yeah, most of that's going to be shaken out over the next few months. And Bitcoin's just going to keep ticking away one block every 10 minutes. There'll be a few other cryptos that keep tagging along, but for the most part, out of like all the 20,000 plus cryptos, many of them are not going to see the next decade.
Right. Right. You had mentioned the hardware and there being variability in the hardware previously. Do you see perhaps a specific type pairing well with nuclear plants, or is that even relevant? Perhaps that's an ignorant question, but there does seem like there's a lot of options when it comes to buying miners. So perhaps for somebody that's ignorant about it, give a little perspective.
Well, optimally, if you have lots of spare electricity, you'd want to go with the newest, most efficient hardware because then you'll be getting the best like operating costs. You'll they'll Yeah, the newest miner right now I think breaks even at about 13 cents per kilowatt hour, and the older S9 breaks even at around 3 cents kilowatt hour. So it really depends on your supply and demand profile. Like if you expect like lots of day-to-day fluctuation and you expect that you're going to have significant periods of time where your miners are turned off, those will be the spaces that you'll want to fill with your less efficient miners where you won't need them as much, but they're there to capture the load if you need to. And then you'll want to have your more top of the line miners in a situation where they're available to be turned off or turned down, but you want to minimize the amount of doing that. You want to keep them running as maximally as possible. And then just on the hardware front, there's new players entering the game. Jack Dorsey's company, I think it's called Spiral. I think they just announced what they're calling the mining development kit, which it sounds like they want to more open source the the manufacturing and just the making of different types of ASICs. It sounds like they want to design a chip that then other tinkerers can take that chip and build their own ASICs around the chip rather than everything's pretty much been going through two companies, MicroBT and Bitmain, as the two primary ASIC manufacturers, and they're based in China, so there's just jurisdictional risk if there's any trouble getting things to America out of China if the tensions between these adversarial states starts to ramp up. It's beneficial to have domestic infrastructure to build these chips and circuit boards that we're going to need, not just for mining, but for just about every other industry that requires complex circuit boards in order to operate. So that's why we're seeing, I think, the Taiwan, the TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Yeah, they're building an operation, I think, in Arizona or New Mexico. Intel wants to build new facilities in America. So the more competitors in the space building hardware and making that even more competitive is just going to give the miners more optionality as to how they build their operations. Because maybe you want to be running your newest hardware at its maximum output, where you're burning like almost 4 kilowatts, and then so you want to get the most out of them as fast as possible, like when you're in a bull market. But then
Hmm.
you flip around to a bear market, maybe you want to run that same miner at 1.5 kilowatts, where you're not putting out as much hash rate, but you'll maximize your efficiency. So at your high hash rate, you're probably running at about 25 joules per terahash. But then if you can turn it down and run it at 21 joules per terahash, and just depending on the macro environment and the electricity costs that you're paying for, like those are just different variables that the miners can tweak in their operations to match the situations that they find themselves. It's these are very interesting people that are very smart engineers, and they're tinkering with these like every day. Like if
Yeah.
anybody wanted to get like a really good website that has lots of data, it's called the Hash Rate Index. It's put out by a company called Luxor. They've got their own mining pool. They've got mining, is it firmware for the miners that gives you even more control than the stock firmware that you would get from Bitmain. You can control your power input more finely. You can control your fan speed more finely. You can grid them together so that you can have like a block of miners that you can control as one. Like there's a lot of really cool features that are being developed, and it's just more competition in the space, and it's good, I- especially like in the open source environment. Like I would like to see more of that coming to more energy systems, but it's this old way of everybody's trying to protect their data, and everything's protected and sensitive, and
Yeah.
nobody wants to share how they've solved a problem because they want to keep it a secret and maximize the money they can earn on it. Whereas in the Bitcoin space, it's like when somebody comes up with a new fix, they try to share it with everybody, and then everybody adopts it, and then the entire ecosystem is better for it. So I would like to see more of that kind of ethos bleed out into the energy systems, but we will see. Lots of lessons to be learned from these technologies working together.
Absolutely. Do you know if there's any nuclear plants that are currently using Bitcoin or pairing with it?
I know with absolute certainty the Susquehanna reactor in Pennsylvania is mining Bitcoin. They just turned on a site that's using 40 megawatts. And then aside from that, there's a company called Oklo. They're one of the SMR vendors that's coming up with a new design. They have a partnership with a Bitcoin mining company that they're going to pair their reactors with once they come to the market. Um, I'm pretty sure the United Arab Emirates is mining Bitcoin with those new reactors they just turned online. There hasn't been much like fanfare and announcement of it, but the reactors came online, and then like a few months later, it was announced that there was a partnership with Marathon Digital Holdings, which is one of the like top 5 Bitcoin mining companies in America. So that's an interesting development. And then Japan is another one of great interest to me because they are in the process of turning on their reactor fleet and reducing their dependence on imported natural gas that has gotten very expensive over the last 2 years. So yeah, they're gung ho to turn the reactor fleet back on. And it was announced in November, December, a few months ago, that TEPCO is going to engage with flexible computing processes, and they want to implement that at various points in the grid where it would be able to strategically like absorb surplus energy and so that they don't have to curtail. And I see that as a massive tool that they will be able to use as they turn this reactor fleet on to keep things in balance when they go when reactors come up and then gas plants go down. There's going to be a very fluid period where there's going to be a lot of electrons on the grid that need to find a good home that may otherwise cause disruption and out of the narrow frequency band that the grids like to operate within.
Got it.
So yeah, I
That's
think
that's significantly more than I thought.
actually there was another one. I cannot miss this one. El Salvador just last week announced that they are partnering with a company that's building a thorium reactor. So I don't expect to see that built before we start seeing the rest of the Generation 4 reactor fleets come online, but that is a very interesting development that the Bitcoin country is engaging with nuclear power.
Yeah, that's crazy. So how fast do you see this developing? How fast do you see it transitioning? You sound very bullish on it, and I
Very.
personally think it's a great idea, right? Do you see this becoming even more mainstream than it already is?
I do. I am confident that it will come mainstream. There's a fight going on right now between those that believe that it's a hindrance to climate change because it is using power, and sometimes that power that it's being used is coming from fossil fuel based power plants. Or the other argument that they'll get into is that, oh, that power that the Bitcoin miners are using could otherwise be used for some other process, like what EVs or hydrogen production. And in some cases, sure, but then in other cases, like if you're in the middle of a Iqaluit, you're not going to really care too much to have electric vehicles. You're going to want combustion engines that far north, and you're going to want like confidence in your energy systems, and you're not
Yeah,
going to you're the further remote you get, the higher complexity like your transport and storage constraints will become like when you do have other products like because like like making aluminum in remote like Iceland, like you have your storage, you've got your transportation, and then you're going to have to have security on it, and there's all kinds of like other concerns that you have and constraints that you have to weigh when you're uh, developing like different energy systems in northern and remote communities. So I think just the fact that the miners don't have the transport and the storage constraints, that gives them a lot more optionality as to where they can be deployed as opposed to certain other technologies like chemical productions and
right.
electric vehicles. So like there'll definitely be a place for them, but like I could foresee like just an SMR being just off the side of the highway, and then that's your charging station, and then it's backed up with ASICs for when it's not charging cars, so that it's always generating its full output and monetizing that, and then just take that money and then just recycle it into building more infrastructure.
Absolutely. Well, Ryan, leave us on an optimistic note. It's been great to talk to you, but yeah, where do you see this going?
I believe this is going to be a very gradual and then sudden transition that we are going to find ourselves in. It's going to feel like it's very slow moving for the next few years. And then all of a sudden, once SMRs start hitting the commercial market, once more Bitcoin mining is engaged with by like major energy companies, like we're already starting to see like Exxon and like ConocoPhillips engaging with it, the more we see of that, a trickle is going to become a torrent, and we're not going to be like it's going to catch a lot of people off guard, and I'm excited to see what happens. But I hope that we do not have a complete collapse of the system before we can build these parallel systems that can take the load when it ultimately comes crashing down around us. I hope I hope I hope we don't have any more banks fail in the next few weeks.
We can leave it there. So,
Yeah, it's
Brian,
the future is bright, the future is orange. We're building the lifeboats to get us off of the sinking Fiat ship. That's where I'll leave that.
perfect. Love it. Ryan MacLeod, really appreciate the time. Thanks so much for chatting with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.